The world remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis as 13 days of fear, politicians, and nuclear standoffs. But almost nobody knows that the closest humanity ever came to total destruction didn't happen in the White House or the Kremlin. It happened deep under the black waters of the Caribbean Sea. It happened inside a metal tube, packed with sweat, heat, fear, and nuclear weapons. It happened because one man refused to agree to what everyone else believed was the only choice. This is the story of Vasili Arkhipov, the man who quietly, silently, and almost unknowingly stopped World War III. On October 27, 1962, the world was already on fire. American spy planes had photographed Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. The United States had imposed a naval blockade. Soviet ships were heading toward it. Fighter jets were scrambling. Missiles were on standby, and both nations were locked in the deadliest staring contest in history. Above the surface, politicians argued. But below, out of sight, something far more terrifying was unfolding. The Soviet submarine B-59 had been traveling for days in suffocating heat. Temperatures inside the submarine had reached over 45 degrees Celsius, 113 Fahrenheit. The air was stale, thick, metallic. The crew hadn't seen daylight in days. Many were dizzy, coughing, stumbling. And most importantly, they were cut off. No communication with Moscow. No idea what was happening above. They didn't know if war had already started. The Americans didn't know the submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. Not a regular torpedo, a nuclear warhead capable of destroying an aircraft carrier group in seconds. Think about that. One submarine, one torpedo, one decision could have set the entire world on a path of nuclear hell. American ships located the submarine and began dropping practice depth charges, explosives meant to signal the submarine to surface. To the Soviets below, those explosions felt like real attacks. The hull shook violently. Lights flickered. Crewmen fell against the metal walls. Dust rained from the pipes. To them, it wasn't a signal. It was war. Inside the control room, panic mixed with anger. The captain of B-59, Valentin Savitsky, was convinced that the United States had already begun a nuclear attack on the USSR. He shouted that they would not simply die at the bottom of the ocean. If they were going to perish, they would strike back. They would launch the nuclear torpedo. But launching a nuclear weapon on a Soviet submarine required the approval of 3 men: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander aboard the submarine. 2 were prepared to launch. 1 man remained: Vasili Arkhipov. The youngest of the 3, thin, pale, exhausted, but the only one not blinded by fear. Arkhipov listened to the captain rage. He listened to the explosions shaking the submarine. He heard crewmen begging for action. He saw men fainting from heat and stress. He knew the situation was spiraling. And despite all that, he hesitated. Because Arkhipov believed something others did not. He believed the Americans were not trying to kill them. He believed the war had not started. He believed there was still a chance to survive without destroying the world. And so he did the unthinkable. He said no. In a submarine filled with terrified men ready to unleash nuclear fire, one quiet officer said no. And that changed everything. Captain Savitsky couldn't believe it. He shouted. He argued. He accused Arkhipov of cowardice. Men watched in disbelief. Who would say no at a moment like this? But Arkhipov stayed calm. He insisted again and again that they surface, that they verify what was happening, that they give life another chance, that they not launch a nuclear weapon blindly. It wasn't just bravery, it was clarity. Rational thought in an irrational moment. And slowly, painfully, his calmness cut through the storm. The captain eventually agreed. The submarine rose. When it surfaced, American ships surrounded it, not with missiles firing, but with surprise, confusion, and cameras. There was no war, no attack, no nuclear apocalypse. Archipov's gamble had been right. The submarine limped home in disgrace, humiliated by the Soviet Navy for surfacing and not fighting. No medals, no praise, no recognition. Arkhipov returned to his quiet life, never boasting about the decision that saved humanity. But deep down, he knew. The world would never know how close it came. The world would never understand that the decision not to fire was harder than firing. The world would never know that while presidents and generals played their high-level chess, the real hero was sitting in a cramped submarine, sweating, exhausted, and choosing peace over pride. But that choice, made in one moment, in one submarine, stands today as one of the greatest acts of human responsibility in history. Imagine what the world would have looked like if Arkhipov had nodded yes instead of no. Picture the explosion ripping through the sea, obliterating American destroyers. The shockwave racing through the blockade. News reaching the White House within minutes. A Soviet nuclear strike on U.S. forces. The president's advisors screaming for retaliation. Missiles launching toward Soviet soil. Soviet radars detecting the attack, firing back with everything they had. Cities burning. Communication systems failing. Leaders making decisions in panic. Millions dying within the first hour. The world ending in a storm of fire. That is the future Arkhipov prevented with one decision. But why was Arkhipov the only one capable of seeing clearly when everyone else was blinded by fear? The answer lies in his past. Before B-59, Arkhipov had already survived an earlier nuclear disaster. He served on the Soviet submarine K-19, nicknamed the Widowmaker. A reactor on K-19 malfunctioned, threatening to melt down and explode. Arkhipov witnessed bravery, chaos, and death as the crew fought to repair it. Many of his closest comrades died of radiation exposure. Arkhipov barely survived. That experience shaped him. It taught him how quickly fear leads to fatal decisions. It taught him that pressure creates mistakes. It taught him that calmness is a weapon. And on B-59, he used that weapon. While everyone else was thinking emotionally, Arkhipov was thinking rationally. While others were shaking with anger, he was analyzing. While others wanted to react, he wanted to understand. He had a quiet authority. He wasn't loud, he wasn't forceful, but his presence carried weight. Even the captain, who outranked him, respected him enough to listen. Not because he was shouting commands, but because he radiated the calmness that only comes from surviving the worst. Inside that burning hot submarine, with oxygen running low and the crew on the edge of collapse, Arkhipov managed to do what almost no human can do under extreme pressure. He stayed logical. But the world never learned his name at the time. The entire incident was classified for decades. When the submarine returned to Russia, Arkhipov faced criticism instead of praise. The Navy leadership accused the crew of cowardice, saying they should have fought harder, resisted longer, refused to surface. The irony is heartbreaking. The very act that saved the world was seen as a shameful failure. Arkhipov didn't protest. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He returned home and lived quietly with his wife. He didn't tell her what happened. He didn't tell anyone. He carried the weight alone. Meanwhile, political leaders on both sides continued negotiating, unaware that the real world-ending trigger had been in the hands of one man below the ocean. As the crisis eased, the world breathed a sigh of relief. History wrote that diplomacy had prevented nuclear war. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth. The submarine crew knew. They whispered among themselves that Arkhipov had saved them, and likely everyone else. But the world moved on. Years later, Archipov's health slowly deteriorated because of radiation exposure from his earlier submarine disaster. He died in 1998, never recognized publicly during his lifetime. Never rewarded, never thanked, just a quiet man who once made a choice that changed everything. And then, decades later, declassified documents emerged. Historians dug into the records. Interviews resurfaced. And the world finally learned the truth that on October 27, 1962, the closest humanity came to nuclear war did not involve a missile launch, a coded message, or a military general. It was one man, inside one submarine, saying one word: no. Looking back today, with everything we know about nuclear weapons, geopolitics, and the fragile balance of global power, Archipov's decision feels even more extraordinary. It wasn't just a man preventing a torpedo launch. It was a human being refusing to surrender to fear during the tensest moment in modern history. It was the purest form of courage, not the courage to fire a weapon, but the courage to restrain one. What makes the story even more powerful is that Arkhipov had nothing to gain, no glory, no promotion, no victory to celebrate. In fact, he risked being punished, humiliated, and even court-martialed for disobeying a captain's order. But he chose reason over pride, and that choice saved hundreds of millions of lives. Today, people talk about heroes, athletes, celebrities, billionaires, but real heroes are often invisible. Real heroes are people who make the hard choice when no one is watching. Real heroes are people like Vasili Arkhipov. Imagine the alternate reality where he said yes. Imagine the images of ruined cities, burned landscapes, and generations wiped away. Imagine a world where humanity never recovered. That is not exaggeration. It is what nuclear war would have meant in 1962. It was total destruction. And the man who prevented that disaster lived and died quietly, barely known beyond his family and a handful of fellow submariners. In a strange way, that makes the story even more powerful. He never asked the world to thank him. He never claimed to be a savior. He never wrote a book or gave interviews. He never once bragged that he saved civilization. He simply did what he believed was right, and then he went home. Only after his death did the world learn that it owed its existence to him. Humanity is still here because one man on a submarine chose calm over chaos. One man chose patience over panic. One man believed there was still hope when everyone else believed there was none. So when people say one person can't change the world, they're wrong. One person can. One person did, and his name was Vasili Arkhipov. He stopped World War III. Without him, this world, our world, might not exist.